All right. So thank you all one last time for coming. I know this has been a really trying time for folks. You know, I've felt a number of emotions, and I know many of you all are as well, from anger and sadness and fear and sorrow. It has been a really trying time. Today, I want to just, make sure to recognize that today would have been Breonna Taylor's 27th birthday. And so I think it is, a really incredible thing to see the movement that has grown out of this tragedy. And we need to honor her and all the others whose lives were taken, and really hold space for them. And so I want to start by offering a moment of silence for y'all to engage with us in a moment of silence. Thank you all. I hope that in this training we can remember why we're doing this, right? And center on the folks, the Black people throughout our country who are being disproportionately targeted and by the police and by white supremacy, and that we are all in this fight together to create a better Kansas and to create a better United States. And in the midst of all these feelings of tragedy and sadness and anger and frustration, I also want to uplift a little bit of hope. I think that what we have seen in this come out in the streets over the last week and a half of the people showing up and showing out in the ways that they haven't before, people engaging in hard conversations about racism and police brutality and accountability in ways that they haven't before. And even with this training, in about 24 hours, we had 250 people RSVP saying, I want to know my rights to protest so that I can be involved and protest as this tragedy rolls out. So we need to hold on to that hope a little bit so that we keep on moving forward. And I invite you all to do that with us here. So now I want to just review the agenda for today. So welcome and agenda review. We're in the midst of that right now. We're going to jump first into a Know Your Rights to Protest presentation that Kiana Noland and Melissa Styler, two of our organizers, are going to lead us through. We'll cover where can I protest, what can I say, do I need a permit, and can I film the police? This will be really essential for anyone who's planning to attend a protest to know what your rights are, how to make sure that they're protected, and what to do if they are violated. We will then shift gears. We're going to make a hard break there in the middle, and then shift into a legal observer training that will be run by Lauren Bonds, our legal director here at the ACLU of Kansas. We will make a strong break there to make it really clear that these are two different things. If you are choosing to be a legal observer, you are choosing to not participate in the protest as a protester. You are an outside neutral person observing the protest, and we'll go much more into depth about what that means, but I think it's really important to draw that distinction. So this first half of the training is a general know your rights to protest and free speech here as folks are taking action, and that is for anyone participating in a protest. And then we'll take a pause, we'll do a screen change, you'll notice, and talk about it. And then we will shift into the legal observer training. Folks are welcome to jump off as we make that shift if you are not interested in learning the legal observer piece of this. So that is our plan for today. And before we jump in, I also want to just uplift a COVID-19 reminder. So in the midst of everything that we're facing and everything we are up against right now, we're also in the middle of a pandemic, and we need to remember that, and we need to protect each other from this pandemic. And we know that Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. So I encourage you, this is our general guidance during COVID for participating in protests or rallies or anything like that. So we encourage you to wear a mask and gloves. We encourage you to keep distance of at least 6 feet between yourself and others. Utilize hand sanitizer if you're unable to frequently wash hands. Include a layer of removable exterior clothing and a plastic bag. So wearing another set of clothes on top of the clothes you're going to walk into your house in helps protect the spread of those germs. And then we also really encourage folks to quarantine for 14 days following any close interaction with other people. That would include attending a protest if you are closer than 6 feet from other folks. And just to note that the ACLU of Kansas is not encouraging individuals to attend in-person gatherings. And in fact, our in-person gatherings as an organization are still suspended. So attending a protest is a personal choice, and we encourage you to make that choice with as much information as you can get, which is partially why we are doing this training today. So I will now pass it over to Melissa and Kiana to take us through the Know Your Right to Protest.
Hi, everyone. We're so excited that you could join us today. My name is Kiana Nolan. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am based in the Wichita office, and I run our Smart Justice campaign as the field organizer.
Hi there, my name is Melissa Styler. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm based in the Kansas City office, but I work across the state running our voting rights program or our citizen participation campaign.
Okay, so where can you protest? You can protest in all public spaces. So that includes sidewalks, streets, and parks. And those are where the rights as protesters are strongest. You can also protest on private property, but you can only protest in those places if you have permission from the property owner. So that would include residences, businesses, parking lots, and driveways. Those are all included private property. And then you can protest in government buildings, but it does depend on which kind of building.
Okay, so let's dive into whenever you're at the protest, what can you say, what's protected, what isn't? So the First Amendment protects all political speech. This also means that counter-protesters and the white supremacists that have been showing up to these rallies, their free speech is protected as well. Police are supposed to treat protesters and counter-protesters equally. They are also permitted to keep these groups separated, but they should allow them within sight and sound of one another. The government cannot and should not censor speech because it is unpopular. So speaking out against police violence perhaps is not very popular with some portions of our government, but that doesn't mean that they can censor you if you want to talk about it. What they can censor is speech that invites imminent violence or law breaking. So for example, if this white supremacist counter-protester group is threatening the lives of members of the Black Lives Matter movement, that is something that the government can censor, though of course we'll talk about if your rights are violated or if the police are not doing what they're supposed to be doing a little bit later in the presentation.
Do I need a permit? So the government can require you to obtain a permit if you're engaging in some protest activities, and that includes if you're trying to shut down a street for a march, or if you're using amplification. And this can be seen like when you do attend a women's march or something. A lot of those require permits because you are shutting down the streets. And government cannot require a permit to just march on a sidewalk, and the government also cannot require a permit for protests in response to recent events in the news. And generally, you don't need a permit for demonstrations that don't present serious traffic violations and safety issues and just problems for the streets and the sidewalks.
So, can you film the police? Yes, you can. 100% you can. The right to photograph and videotape police officers and others during protests and at all other times in public spaces is protected by the First Amendment. The police officer is not supposed to confiscate or demand to view any digital photographs or videos without a warrant under any circumstances. Officers may legitimately order individuals to stop activities that are interfering with them doing their job. So for example, if you are filming the police and you are in between them and the protester that they are trying to arrest, that is considered interfering. If there's any kind of like an active violence situation and you're very close to that violence, that's considered interfering. But if you the best bet is to stay off to the side, again, on that public property, as best as you can. Yeah, you can absolutely film whatever is going on.
Okay, so the best practices around protecting your content. You should record on your phone. It's a little easier and accessible, and make sure you upload to a secure cloud as soon as you are able. So for a lot of iPhones, depending on how you have your settings, some of that stuff can immediately upload to your cloud when you get Wi-Fi. And you should turn off the facial recognition feature on your phone, and also turn off the Touch ID. You should lock your phone, and if your phone is capable, you should make sure that there is at least a 6-digit passcode, and make sure your phone locks immediately. So sometimes there's a delay when people are locking their phones, but you should make sure it locks immediately. And I will actually pass this to Melissa because she had some really good tips on why you should make sure your phone locks immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we'll also talk about in general what to do if your rights are violated. But specifically with this, I've seen personally in protests over the past 10 years that I've been organizing, but also in protests as of right now, if they're arresting you and you don't have it to where your phone immediately locks, I have seen the police go through and see the pictures that and the videos that you've been recording. We'll again talk about what to do if your rights are violated, but we deeply encourage every single one of you to do everything that you possibly can to protect your rights from the get-go. It's a lot better to have a good offense than try and scramble later to be defensive. So let's actually talk about that effect. We could go to the next slide. What to do if your rights are violated. So treat it like a car accident or a break-in or any other given crime, where you write down every single little thing, you record everything as soon as possible about what happened with the incident, whenever your mind is fresh, whenever it's not just, you know, that officer pushed me, but you're detailed, you're talking about kind of the emotional impact that it had in that moment as well. So make sure that you include officers' badge and patrol car numbers if you can get that information, their name if you can get that information, and something that is kind of difficult, but particularly important in this moment is the agency that they work for. So we're seeing in protests across the state, and especially in the Kansas City area, that it's not just KCPD or one police force who's on the scene. So for example, about a week ago, whenever the protesters in Topeka were tear gassed, that was by the Kansas Highway Patrol. That was not by Topeka Police Department. And so whenever you're documenting these things, you want to know who you're interacting with in that moment, so that way if there's an ability to hold them accountable, you're holding the right folks accountable. In protests, normally there's a lot of people around you. Try to get their contact information, and especially if anybody else got it on video, make sure that you're coordinating with witnesses around you so they can back up your story. The more perspectives that we have, the more there's strength in numbers in protecting your rights as well. So try to get that contact information from folks. Take photographs of any injuries, not just in that moment. So if you're pepper sprayed or tear gas, take a picture of your face, but also like if you're pushed down, your bruises might not show up until a day or two later. Make sure that you're consistently taking pictures of these, and even better if those pictures can be time-stamped. Immediately seek legal advice. So we at the ACLU have a legal intake form online. That's the best way to get in touch with us the quickest. But additionally, a lot of folks, a lot of lawyers from across the state have been banding together to offer pro bono services. We are in coordination. We are not running, but we are in coordination and referring to folks to that pro bono network of lawyers across the state. You can always get in contact with us and we can refer you to those folks. They'll have the best advice for your individual circumstances. Something I want to point out that is incredibly important is if you are arrested, do not say anything, do not sign anything. The police can lie to you. The police can have you sign something that says that you're guilty of something that you're not guilty of, just so you can get out of jail faster. Don't do any of that. Don't say anything, don't sign anything, just try and get your phone call. There's a number of jail support hotlines across the state. If you need help finding that information, you can reach out to us and we can refer you to them. Of course, we can help connect you with the legal support network as well. Try to get that phone call and let jail support do its job. Don't say anything and don't sign anything while you're under arrest. Once you have all of this information, there's a lot of different places that you can move with that. So you can file a written complaint with the agency's internal affairs division or civilian complaint board. and absolutely, whatever legal support you're working with, they can help guide you through that process and also talk about additional things. I do want to, before we continue on and really go into kind of the legal aspect of things, just as a protester, I want to let you all know that really the police can do whatever they want in these circumstances. I've been arrested on the sidewalk whenever I wasn't violating any laws. I've been arrested whenever I was operating as a legal observer. I've been arrested with journalists. I was arrested for using sidewalk chalk, and the district attorney tried to charge me with a felony destruction of public property. Thankfully, my pro bono lawyer pled me down to a misdemeanor littering charge, which as a progressive, a littering charge might be even worse than that destruction of property charge. I don't know, but I just urge you all to take all of this very, very seriously, to ask us any questions that you have. We will advise you to the best of our ability, and do not underestimate what could possibly happen and the violence that could happen at these protests. Do everything that you can to be proactive in fighting for your rights in advance.
Thank you, Melissa and Kiana. That was really helpful. And I just want to echo what Melissa just said. I think especially with these current protests being focused on police brutality, police actions, I think that the police are acting even more aggressively than we have seen in protests in the past. And so really being aware of your rights and your protections, and being aware that they might be violated and you need to be ready for that. And you surviving this is important to the fight for the long term. So making sure you have as much information as you need is really important. And one of those pieces, as I will close with another COVID-19 reminder, because we are still in the midst of a pandemic. So after the protest is over, based on the information we talked about in the beginning, you want to remove that exterior layer of clothing that you have and put it in your plastic bag before, you heard my Minnesota accent come out there, my bag. Before returning home or entering any other place with other people around you. Like if you're going to, we've got a supermarket here in the PowerPoint, but if you're going to go ride in a car, know that the COVID-19 virus might be carried on your clothes and transferred to other surfaces or other people. Go home and wash your hands. I think we're all doing this already, but make sure you wash your hands thoroughly. And then also, if you develop any COVID-like symptoms, such as a fever, be sure to contact anyone that you know that you have contact information with, that you were in close contact with. That includes people that you may or may not have, been close to at the protests. So we'll close with that and actually shift over to questions. So we've already got a couple questions in, but as a reminder, you can enter those in the Q&A chat box or the regular chat box. Q&A is a little bit helpful for us so that we can keep track of them better, but either way works. We love to hear your questions. So the first is, what do you do if an officer tells you to stop filming and you know you have a right to? I want to pass this to our legal director, Lauren Bonds, because I think she has a great response to this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and I would say this generally as it applies to any of the rights that you know that you have, that police officers or law enforcement officers are actively violating. Even if you're right, it is helpful. You should comply with the officer and their request. And I think that that's important because your safety is the utmost priority, as we've been discussing. Your safety and your ability to continue doing this work in the long term is more important than anything you're going to be able to record on a given day at a given protest. So if you, to the extent you think that your safety is at risk if you were to continue filming, then I think you should comply with the officer. However, I think that it's always completely fine if you feel comfortable and you're reading the situation and you think you might be able to have dialogue with the officer to assert your rights and say, I have a protected First Amendment right, or a right under the First Amendment to film in public spaces when you're engaging in public activity. And you can even ask the officer, am I interfering with your work in some way? If they're like, yeah, I don't want you here, then that might be, you might say, like, that's not enough of an interference. Like, if you feel comfortable engaging in dialogue, I'm not going to say you shouldn't do it, but always kind of assess the situation and put your safety first.
Thank you, Lauren. Another question we've got is, there's an ACLU video app. Should we use that? Lauren, do you want to take that one as well, actually?
Yeah, so there is the ACLU, if you're talking about the ACLU Blue app, that is an app that our national ACLU has access to. And if we wanted to get access to any videos you uploaded there, we as the affiliate could eventually get access to that. We'd have to go through tech support in our organization. So that is an option. However, I think we would advise, if you are going to be, particularly if you're going to be legal observing, there's a different place we would advise that you send the video first. So we can talk a little bit more about that during the legal observer training. But as a general matter, if you want to use the app is fine.
Thank you. So this next question is, does the ACLU have a hotline to use as as the place to call if we're arrested? Melissa, do you want to actually take this one?
Sure. So the ACLU of Kansas, we are doing support work within the movement. We are not leading the movement work. So we can refer you, depending on where your location is, to the best jail support line in your area. But there's not one single ACLU hotline number that you can call to get connected into our legal team. Because again, we're providing that support work to the movement rather than trying to make sure we're managing the whole process.
And I will just add, so yeah, we are not doing jail support as the ACLU. There are local funds that Melissa was just talking about, and I would encourage you, if you are going to a protest, especially right now, before you go, make sure you have that phone number. A best practice is to write it in Sharpie on your hand or your arm, so that if you are arrested, you have that phone number. You don't have to memorize it, but make sure you have that information before you attend a protest. We've also got, and Lauren, I'll have you take this one. Do these protocols change if a National Guardsman gives directives or attempts to arrest you on the sidewalk, street, etc.? Have they been involved in Kansas?
So none of your rights change if it's the National Guard versus a police officer enforcing these kinds of, trying to enforce these kinds of laws or potentially violating your rights. So all of the rules are the same. It might feel a little different in the moment if it's a National Guards person versus a police officer, but you still have your same First Amendment rights regardless of whether the National Guard is present or it's the police who are present. In terms of whether they've been involved in Kansas, to my knowledge, they have at certain protests, but I don't know specifically which cities and which nights they've been out, so.
Thank you. We've also got, how do you deal with racial slurs from passerbys? Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I don't think that you necessarily have any type of obvious constitutional claims to bring against someone unless it's a police officer or some member of government who's saying those slurs to you. If it is just kind of another private individual who's targeting you with these racially harassing or any other type of harassing speech, that's always something that you can report to. You can report in the same way you would report any other harassment. And I think it's just, once again, important to make sure that you're prioritizing your safety. So it's information that you can record if you want to do something with it later. But always, make sure that you're keeping a safe distance and thinking about your safety in that situation.
I also want to just throw out there that all throughout protests in Kansas, there's been a large white supremacist presence. You have the right to record the white supremacists and counter protesters who are coming here. And then, of course, if you so choose, you could either share that with movement leaders, so that way people can track what kind of level of threats of violence are happening here, coming from these local folks.
Thank you. So I've gotten two questions that say, where can we find the jail hotline phone numbers? So the best place to start with that is to contact the organizers of the protest. They are typically the ones who have a program or are coordinating around jail support. Also, as we said, we can email those out. After this training, we are going to send out both the PowerPoints from the content today, as well as some additional follow-up materials. So we can include some of that in what we send. We've got a question that says, if you want to create and host a protest, what are the necessary components that we need to ensure we do? So I would say step one is making sure that you are following the lead of the Black folks in your community that have asked, that are most directly impacted by this work. So number one, being in relationship with people and starting to coordinate with them. And then from there, it's, you got to talk to other people, right? You want to make sure you know where you're going to be, when you're going to be there. What is the plan? Are we going to stay on the sidewalks? Are we going to try to take a street and sort of go from there. But it's figuring out like, who are the speakers? What are we going to do? Anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd also like Kiana to speak more on the Wichita area and what's been happening there. In this moment, what we're seeing is it's not, well, yes, absolutely. Make sure that, especially speaking to my fellow white folks, we don't know the best responses to this. We shouldn't pretend like we do. We should be following the support of Black leaders within our own communities. But that being said, there's not one major organization who's coordinating these efforts across the state of Kansas. This is an authentic grassroots movement. There are a number of things and resources that you can provide to the people who are attending this, but oftentimes jail support, any kind of like bail funds or legal support funds, the pro bono lawyers, none of those people are the ones who are organizing these protests. And so sharing that information as you find it and doing your research is the most responsible thing that you can do. The other thing that I have seen as like a pretty common mistake is the difference between public and private property is an invisible line that you cannot know. And I've seen protests be organized on what appears to be public property, but is actually private property. And the police response to that is very different. So just doing your homework a little bit and making sure that everything that you're advising is focused on de-escalating this situation rather than potentially putting especially Black lives at risk.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
Kiana.
I was just going to say, I echo all of Melissa's thoughts. And just to touch on some things that are happening in Wichita, I know a lot of people saw the 2 young Black men who were arrested the day before yesterday for sharing the Facebook post about a riot. So I would say I would be super careful about sharing anything that talks about illegal activity, because we know that our police are heightened right now and they are taking people to jail. And you can read that in the news and on social media, but be careful about what you're spreading on social media, especially if it alludes to something that is illegal and not a protest.
Thank you, Kiana. And I would just add, like, as I think that's a really great point of like the police, but we can't make this point enough. The police are heightened right now. And so being cautious and knowing the full risk of participating is really important. An additional layer that I will add on to that is also the pandemic. Right, we know that across Kansas, in jails, social distancing is not a thing. In jails, they can take your mask, they can take the protections you may have, and so know that you are, if you are high risk and you are arrested, you are increasing your potential exposure to the virus. Additionally, if you end up charged with a felony and end up serving time or probation or whatever it may be, if you are still on paper by the election, you will not be able to vote. So being aware that getting arrested in these protests could remove your ability to vote, your right to vote this election, and just keeping that in mind. We've got a question asking, can you address the private public property line at the Country Club Plaza in Kansas City, Missouri? So, you know, many folks have probably heard about the police forcing people not to enter the street and stay on the sidewalk. Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I think sometimes police will make that distinction for you, and then you'll figure out what the demarcation is. But I think it's always sometimes helpful to just speak with people who have organized and held protests in the area in the past. They're probably the best resource for helping you distinguish between private property and public property. But as a general matter, you know, I think, you know, sidewalks, streets, and parks are what are called traditional public forums. That is what the courts have recognized are public spaces for the purposes of protest. When you're getting into parking lots, when you're getting into actual buildings, and when you're getting into kind of private walkways, which sometimes that's hard to distinguish what's a private walkway versus what's a sidewalk. That's where you're getting on private property, and the property owners are the ones who are able to tell you whether you can protest there or not. And so sometimes if there's a genuine question, if you have a genuine question about whether something is private property or public property, sometimes the easiest thing to do also is just to call the store that you might be in front of and say, hey, is your parking lot private or public? And usually, you know, they might know what you're doing, but they'll usually tell you one way or the other. So that's probably what you should know, or kind of the general rules. So once again, streets, sidewalks, parks, the courts have recognized are public. Kind of everything else you want to call and check. It's more than likely going to be private and subject to the private property owners' restrictions on using the property.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. We've got time for about 1 or 2 more questions, but I haven't gotten any in. Oh, we just got one. Okay, so we'll take this one and then whatever next comes, and then we'll need to move on to the next section of the training. So we've got, a lot of people are using riot as an excuse to dismiss the peaceful protest and to shift the focus to the rioters instead. What can we do to change that? So I will answer that. That is not necessarily a legal question about our rights, but I think it is a broader, important movement question, right? And to do this work. So firstly, I think it's really important to always center on the why this is happening, right? Like we need to remember George Floyd, we need to remember Breonna Taylor, we need to remember Tony Dade, and we need to focus the conversation on that. So I think it's really important to, if someone, whatever they say to you about rioting, right? The response is, let's talk about what's really happening here. Systemic racism in the United States that is murdering Black men and women across this country. That the police are allowed to make those murders and to have that conversation. So I think the first thing is to bring it, to center it back on what this is all really about. And I think that's really the first best step to take. Other folks have thoughts or reactions? Kiana or Melissa, Lauren? Great. I would say, yeah, don't go down that hole. It's not relevant. What is relevant is that we need to change structural racism in this country, and we need to do it now, and there needs to be swift action. And if you want to talk more about it, we can chat offline about how to have that conversation.
I will throw out one thing, and I agree with Alan and Uplift that, like, if you're just arguing with people just to argue with people, Americans' idea of property destruction as violence is pretty strange in comparison to how the rest of the world deals with this. Just don't even do that. But consistently, if you're having like a real and authentic conversation with people, what we've seen not just in Kansas City, but across the entire United States is oftentimes it is the police and other state agents who are escalating situations to points of violence. I have, like, any minimal kind of action that has happened from protesters has resulted in an incredible amount of violence from the police, which has really escalated things beyond points. So again, centering about, like, you know what, a window's gonna be fine. A window can be replaced whenever you have the police escalating circumstances. And whenever you have the police killing Black people in the streets, that's what we need to be focusing on right now.
Thank you, Melissa. And that is going to close our Know Your Rights as a Protester section. I want to thank Kiana and Melissa for being a part of this panel and training us all on those. So round of silent applause from all the people attending. Thank you for that. Now I am going to stop screen sharing for a second and shift us to talk about the legal observer training. So as we mentioned in the beginning of this is a separate role. Legal observers are not participants in these protests. They are a neutral outside role. You are an observer collecting information that can potentially be used in lawsuits to come. If you are not interested in that role, I would encourage, you're welcome to hop off. That is totally fine. We are not offended at all. But if you are interested in learning more about a legal observer, that is what the remainder of this training will be about. So I will start screen sharing again, and Lauren, our legal director, is going to lead this part of the training.
All right, hi everyone, and thank you for the folks who are interested in staying on. As Ellen mentioned, we really want to have a clean divide between the training for, how to protect your rights and exercise your rights as a protester versus how do you do legal observing, because it is these are distinct roles, and you can't show up at a protest and do both. I'll say from the outset that if you are interested in being a legal observer at any particular protest that you're going to be attending, you need to make that decision. You should make that decision before you show up, and just say, I'm here to legal observe. I'm not here to engage in protest. And I think this quote that we've included in this slide puts it really succinctly. You are suspending your First Amendment rights to protect the First Amendment rights of others. So that's what a legal observer does. You are there to make sure that people can vindicate their legal rights, whether that's in a criminal defense posture. So say the police arrest you when you're peacefully protesting, a legal observer's information that they're collecting and evidence that they're collecting could make sure that you don't get, that the protester doesn't get improperly charged or get escalated charges. So, you know, you can do something small, and Melissa was kind of talking about this in her own experience, you know, something small like chalking the sidewalk, and you know, police can try to make that an escalated, you know, incident that carries felony consequences as opposed to a misdemeanor. And so legal observer documentation can make sure that those charges don't get escalated. Additionally, legal observer evidence can also help people vindicate their rights if they have their constitutional First Amendment rights violated or Fourth Amendment rights violated while they're at a protest. So if, you know, people are improperly censored, if they're improperly searched, a legal observer's evidence can help you bring a civil rights lawsuit, an affirmative lawsuit against the government at a later date. And so that's kind of the role you're playing. And in order for all the evidence you're collecting to be as useful as possible, whether that's to help someone in their criminal case or to help someone bring an active civil rights case, you need to be neutral, and you need to be 100% focused on the task at hand, which would be, you know, documenting what's going on at the protest. So I think it's helpful to just kind of explain a couple of things that you are not doing when you're being a legal observer. So you are not a peacekeeper. You are not there to kind of de-escalate tensions that you're seeing between police and protesters. You're not there to step in and say, let's talk this out. You're not there to mediate. You are not a peacekeeper. You do not give legal advice. So even if you're an attorney and you want to serve in this role, you can't be, it will undermine the strength of the evidence you're collecting as a legal observer if you are going around to protesters and telling them, well, actually, yeah, you have the right to be on this property. This is a traditional public forum, or, you know, using any of the information that you acquired in the half of, or the first half of the training to kind of advise people. You shouldn't be doing that if you're legal observing. You shouldn't promise to help or intervene with police on behalf of anyone. So don't say like, oh, if they start bothering you, let me know, I'm the legal observer. Like, that's not what a legal observer does. You can document any problems that you're seeing between police and protesters, but you're not offering any assistance. And once again, you're not trying to mediate. You should not promise anybody legal representation. So once again, even if you know that there's kind of a network out there of attorneys, it's not your position as the legal observer to say, oh, this attorney will, you know, bail you out if you get arrested. That's information that you should make sure that the action organizer passes on to protesters, but that's not your job to let protesters know about that resource. And also, you should be courteous and alert organizers or police to any immediate problems. So that is something that you can do. But once again, that's something you should probably do kind of as a last resort. You want to stay completely out of it and be observing and documenting things. Next slide. Great. So let's talk about the logistics of legal observing. So you kind of know what it is. You're showing up and you're documenting things that are happening at protest. But let's talk about, you know, just kind of what you should do in order to do that most effectively from a practical standpoint. And so the first recommendation that we have is to wear comfortable clothes and good shoes. This would apply to if you're just going to a protest in any context and doing anything. You walk a lot at protest, and you know, the temperatures change, and so it's really important that you are wearing comfortable clothes and wearing good shoes, because you'll do a much better job of legal observing and collecting evidence if you're comfortable. Bring water and snacks. So that is another practical tip. Protests last for a long time. These protests that are going on right now that you'll likely be providing legal observer support for are lasting a long time. So be sure to make sure that you're hydrated and nourished for the task ahead. I would note that you should just be aware that bathrooms are very hard to find at protest. And so don't drink so much or eat so much that you'll need to go to the bathroom a lot. And that's not only just because bathrooms are hard to find, but also because you don't want to step away from the action and miss something important. Charge your phone. That's another important tip I would provide you. Charge your phone or bring a portable charger. Doing this is important just because you're going to be using your phone a lot, and we'll talk about a little bit more all the ways that you'll be using your phone. Another recommendation, bring or figure out the action plan in advance. So you want to know, if civil disobedience is planned, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important to know. And you also want to kind of know, is this going to be a stationary action? Are we marching? Where are we going to be marching? Having all that information is going to help you do your job more effectively and make sure that you're not missing anything important that's going on. And it's also very important when you're showing up on the day of to legal observe to make sure that you have any item of clothing that identifies you as a legal observer. So if you've been to the protest in Kansas City, Missouri, you've probably seen the National Lawyer Guild. They have the bright lime green hats or bright lime green shirts. If the action organizer is providing any type of clothing that would identify you as a lawyer, as a legal observer, definitely put it on. And this will help you maintain kind of that visible distance from the rest of the protesters, and also kind of identify you to the police as a legal observer. And in theory, that should add a layer of protection as you're trying to do your job there. So arrival to-do list. So first things first, if you can, you should check in with your legal observer coordinator if one exists for your action. If one does not exist for the action, you might also want to check in with the attorney who's agreed to represent protesters if they're there. The second thing to do is to figure out what police agencies are present. Is it the sheriff's department? Is it the local police? Is it the National Guard? Is it a collection of all three of these? That's going to be helpful if an incident happens that you need to record, to kind of start narrowing down who's responsible for the incident. So identify who's there, get a sense of what they're wearing, and just have that knowledge before anything starts to happen. Also note where police are in the crowd. This is going to help you make sure that you're capturing anything negative that could potentially happen, or any incident that you might want to record. So that includes, plainclothes cops that you might be seeing, police helicopters, anything, any police presence. You want to note where they are, and that'll help you keep an eye on them as the action progresses. Also, police cameras and traffic cameras, those are helpful to know where they're at. That is, that could potentially be helpful if there is, an arrest that leads to some kind of legal action. Knowing that those cameras exist, knowing that video footage potentially exists, that's going to be something you're going to want to share with any attorney who would be representing the protesters here. And identify and take note of any counter-protesters, agitators, or individuals who seem to be there for a reason other than protesting. And so that doesn't mean you need to go and profile people, but if you see someone who does not look like they're there to support Black lives and for the purpose of the protest, it's good to know where they are, because their presence could lead to incidents that you might want to record. All right, and so what are the things that you're supposed to record? Now you kind of know generally what to look for in advance. Some legal observers, they write down every single thing that they see for the 4 or 5 hours they're at a protest. That would be way too much for me to do, so I definitely don't advise that legal observers take that approach unless they really want to. The things that you're going to want to record are going to be the things that are going to be useful for any attorney who's providing criminal defense support or affirmative civil rights support. And so that's going to be, threats of arrest. So even if it doesn't result in an actual arrest, if you hear police threatening protesters that you'll be arrested if you do X, or if you'll be arrested if you do Y, that could potentially be a violation of the protesters' First Amendment rights, particularly if it says, if you keep saying, F the police, you're going to be arrested. That's not really a restriction that that police officers can put on protesters. That would be a violation of someone's First Amendment rights. And the threat of arresting them for saying that would be chilling their First Amendment activity, and that would be unconstitutional. So threats of arrest are very important to record. actual arrests. So I talked a little bit about why it's important to know whether civil disobedience is planned before, after, or before a protest starts. And one of the reasons that's important is because if civil disobedience is planned and the arrests are taking place pursuant to this planned civil disobedience, that's going to be something you should record, and you should be looking at that to see if there's any kind of excessive use of force, if there's any rights violations in the course of that arrest. But it's probably not something where you need to pay really close attention to who's being arrested and getting their information. If arrests are not planned, that is information that is going to be really important for attorneys to have access to. So unplanned arrest, the only way an attorney can get someone out of jail is if they kind of know their name and date of birth. And so if there are unplanned arrests, you want to not only get all the information that you might want for a planned arrest, i.e. Whether there's an excessive use of force, whether there's kind of any abusive tactics being used by the police, but also the name and the date of birth of the arrestee. For planned arrest, once again, you just want to focus kind of more on the conduct of what's happening. So whether the police are overstepping, whether there's aggressive use of force, things like that. You also want to note aggressive policing tactics, swarming, tear gas, anything that looks like a little bit too much on the police's part. You should make a note of that. There are ACLU affiliates throughout the country right now who are filing lawsuits challenging these aggressive police tactics under the Fourth Amendment. And so that's information that an attorney could very well use to help support and vindicate the rights of protesters in the future. Any use of force. So you don't have to make a distinction about whether use of force is justified. If you see anyone being pushed, if you see anyone being slammed to the ground, regardless of what the protester did before that, you should document it, because it's not for the police officer to make the determination whether the use of force was justified versus excessive. That's a decision that a court should ultimately make. And so you should document it to the extent possible. And then any actions by police that seem excessive or inappropriate. I think you kind of know these when you see them. And they might ultimately be things that you can't bring a lawsuit over, or that won't help someone in their criminal defense. But if you're seeing a pattern, if you're seeing police saying disrespectful things to people, if you're seeing them just acting too aggressively, driving too close to protesters, write it down. Because even if individual incidents aren't enough to bring a lawsuit over, kind of the sum of these incidents, when considered together, might be enough in order to bring a lawsuit and hold a police department accountable if they are engaging in these types of actions. So how do you document incidents? And this is a place where I want to take a beat and talk a little bit about attorney work product privilege. So one of the reasons that we want to make sure legal observers are trained separate from protesters who might be recording this information kind of on their own time, is because legal observers, like I said, the information they collect can be used to help in criminal defense, in the criminal defense of protesters who are arrested and charged. But it also can be used for the purposes of vindicating affirmative civil rights actions. And one of the reasons legal observers' information is going to be more valuable than just other information that's collected is not only because they're neutral, but also because they are acting pursuant to an attorney's direction. And so if you're acting pursuant to an attorney's direction and you're working with an attorney who's agreed to represent the protesters, the information you collect is subject to what we call attorney work product privilege. And so when something's subject to privilege, that means it's protected from the other side getting it. So that would mean, any information you collect, it will be kind of the property of the attorney for the purposes of bringing that legal action. And the other side wouldn't be able to get it and kind of use it against the protesters too. So that's really important and can be really useful when you're putting together a lawsuit and even when you're engaging in a criminal defense. So that's what's special about legal observers, and that's what's special about the evidence that they're going to be collecting. And so one thing that I think is useful one way that I think it's useful to document incidents is to take handwritten notes. And at the top of those notes, you should write attorney work product privilege. And that's going to make sure that anything that you write down isn't subject to disclosure to the defendants. If you're bringing a civil rights lawsuit, or the prosecution, if you're bringing if the protesters are subject to criminal prosecution. And so when you're taking handwritten notes, those are important, I think, in addition to any pictures or video recording that you might take, because you can kind of get more context, right? You're going to get a snapshot of what's going on in the moment. But in the handwritten notes, you can kind of provide your narrative description of what's going on. And that narrative description can be incredibly helpful in terms of, if you aren't able to catch something in the video recording, or if something doesn't come across in a photo, your handwritten notes can really fill out the picture and provide additional facts that could be important for the lawsuit or the legal defense. Video recording, so anything that you observe, it's always good, particularly if there's an incident where there's an interaction between the police and a protester, if you can get it on video, that's kind of the best evidence that you can get. So we strongly support video recording. Taking photos of the incident, so even if a still snapshot of an incident can be helpful and can provide really important, indisputable facts for a lawsuit or a criminal defense. So we strongly encourage taking photos. One note I would make is, even if you can't capture the incident itself on your phone via a picture, via video recording or picture, it's sometimes helpful to just kind of get a picture of the immediate aftermath of any incident. And so that can really show the size of the crowd, the size of the police presence. It can also even help you figure out what the location of the incident was. All these things are going to be helpful in terms of protecting people's rights going forward, and helping with the criminal defense. It's going to provide additional facts that are going to give context. And so those are always important things to take note of and to make sure that you're doing handwritten notes, video recording, and photos. We've already talked a little bit about using an app in the protester training. Assuming it's okay with your attorney coordinator, you can also use an app for recordings and pictures, but you should use the app that they approve of. So if they have a strong preference about what type of app you should use that. But we know that some legal observers are using ACLU Blue app, and that could be an option, assuming that your attorney coordinator suggests that. So now you know how to document. Now you know how to document incidents. Let's talk a little bit more about documenting arrest. So as we mentioned, documenting arrest can be important for two reasons. It's making sure that you're capturing any kind of excessive force or any improper conduct while an arrest is being executed. It's also important for making sure that we identify people who are getting rounded up so we can get them out of jail. For unplanned arrest, right? So things to make sure that you note if you are making a recording or taking notes about an arrest that's taking place, whether officers issued a warning. So that's important, particularly where planned arrests are taking place. If people who were not planning to get arrested that day get kind of lumped in with everybody else, it's good to know whether officers issued a warning or not. They don't always do that. They're not legally required to do that. But it's helpful to give context in terms of whether someone was appropriately arrested or not, and given the opportunity to get out of the way before they were arrested. Whether protesters are given an alternative to arrest, once again, kind of similar to the warning. So, leave or be arrested, particularly for trespass, for arrest for trespass. That's always good to know whether there was a request to leave. Whether officers cited a specific law protesters were violating. So that's really important to record, because I think it helps the attorney identify what criminal defense case they're going to be representing the protester in. But also, if there isn't a specific law cited, that can sometimes be evidence that the arrest wasn't appropriate, that they're just arresting people because they don't want them there, not necessarily because they're breaking any particular law. So always note whether an officer cited a specific law that the protesters were violating. And also whether arrests seem targeted at specific people. So, note if more people of color are being arrested, if leaders are being targeted. So if you see 15 people all in the same place and, the police are going up and arresting, only a couple people, and they're all standing together and they're saying, I'm arresting this person for trespass. That doesn't smell right? Like if everyone's trespassing, if those people they're arresting are trespassing. And that can be a civil rights violation if certain people, whether it's because they're Black, whether it's because they're the, kind of leaders of the organization, if they're being targeted, for arrest, that can be a potential constitutional violation. That's something that the attorney who's representing the protesters is really going to want to know. And also just in terms of making sure that you're providing attorneys with the evidence they would need to bring kind of an excessive force type of case. See what type of restraints are being used, whether it's handcuffs, do they look too tight? That's always something that's good to note if you are recording an arrest. Okay, once again, and I'll just keep reiterating this, if there are unplanned arrests and you see, or if you see somebody who has indicated that they are not interested in participating in civil disobedience where civil disobedience is planned in an action, make sure you get their name and date of birth, because that's going to be essential to figuring out how you can get them out of jail, or how the attorney who's representing them can get them out of jail. So what to document? Just be as specific and detailed as possible, particularly when you're taking these handwritten notes. First things first, make sure that you are writing the time, date, and location of the incident down. There have been a lot of protests. These protests are back to back to back. And so, if you are trying to share this information with a protester's attorney a couple of days later, you might not remember what day this happened on, what time it happened on, or even where the protest was at. And all that information is going to be really important to making sure the evidence is as useful as possible to both the protester and the attorney who's representing them. So always make sure that you put that on the top of your notebook or at the top of your notes if you're writing things down. If you have a video or a picture, you might want to save the file with the time and date and location, just so you'll always remember when you took that video or photo. So officer information, you want to get their badge number, their name, their squad car number, and what agency they're with. You're probably not going to be able to get all of that information at any given time, so get as much as you can. If you can't get the name, try to get the badge number. If you can't get the squad car number, try to get what agency they're with. And that's going to be important for making sure that if you are bringing a civil rights action in the future, that you're able to name, that the attorney who's representing the protester is able to name the responsible, not only the responsible officer, but also the responsible agency. Protester actions, that's also something you should document, particularly if the protester is getting arrested or having their rights violated in some way for doing something that is 100% constitutionally protected. So you don't have to make the determination whether what they're doing is legal or constitutionally protected. Just describe their conduct. Were they marching? Were they having a conversation with the police? Were they, arguing with the counter protester? All that information and those facts are going to be incredibly important for figuring out whether charges that they're facing are appropriate and whether their constitutional rights were violated. So, and when you're recording dialogue, if there is an incident that you're documenting and it's a back and forth between an officer or a protester or a protester and, a counter protester, try to be as specific as possible. What did the police say? What did the protester say? Write down verbatim as much as you can. And this is a place where it might be helpful to have that phone on, just so you don't have to transcribe everything. But if you don't have your phone or you can't get the video up in time, just write down as much as you can, as specific as you can about what words were exchanged. Physical limitations. So this is important just for making sure that you have, once again, context and seeing if the police kind of made a demarcation between where it was appropriate for protesters to be and where it wasn't. So note any of that. That's a good place to use your phone and take a picture and say, here's the barricade. It was at this intersection. It was protecting, this particular building or this, this street from people going on it. And another thing, and the final thing that you'll want to write down and document and make sure that you capture if you're recording an incident is the names and contact information of witnesses. So, as I said at the beginning, you want to limit your interactions with protesters. This is going to be one of the few exceptions. If you witness an incident and you get something on your phone, you also want to look around and see if anyone else saw that and see if they would be willing to serve as a witness for a criminal trial or a civil rights action in the future. Because, not only are they going to be able to kind of corroborate what's on your video or maybe what your notes say, they're also going to potentially be able to give you additional information that you weren't able to capture. So always just, say, hey, I'm a legal observer. Did you just see what I saw, or did you see what happened? Can I get your name and contact information to share with an attorney who will be representing the protesters? And that's all you have to say. You don't have to do the interview with them right there. If they do have facts that they want to provide, it's fine if you take those down, but don't feel obligated to kind of sit down and get someone's like formal affidavit at the time. Okay. So recording the police, we talked about this already a little bit in the protest, Know Your Rights to protest portion of the training. But let's go over it again. So you have a protected First Amendment right to record and photograph the police in public spaces. You also have a right to record police on private property, so long as you have the private property owner's approval to be there and to be filming. So, you know, if things pop off and you somehow there's a, you know, police confrontation that ends up inside of McDonald's, you might want to ask the manager first before you start recording, because they're going to be able to say yes or no. The police officer won't. Officers can't view your photos or videos taken on your cell phone without a warrant. So, you know, if a police officer sees you filming and says, hey, let me see that, you know, you can say, sure, get a warrant. And that will be a completely appropriate thing for you to say in response. The police officer might get mad at you, and like we've been saying, you know, be cognizant that police are very much on edge and they are reacting disproportionately in these protests. But, you know, you have the right to keep the photos and the videos on your cell phone without showing it to a police officer. They can't delete your photographs or videos or require you to delete them. And then there's only kind of one situation that we already talked about it, where an officer can order you to cease filming. And that's if you're legitimately interfering with their work. And so sometimes it's helpful to actually ask them to identify how you are interfering with them. You might not get, like I said, a real, you might not get a real classy response there, but it's fine for you to ask them to identify what you're doing, specifically if you are maintaining a distance. And we'll talk a little bit here in a second about best practices for recording the police. Okay, so best practice number one, uses cell phones. So courts have recognized that you have a much higher expectation of privacy in your cell phone than you would in some other types of camera and video recording devices. So, you know, in your cell phone, you have your contacts, you have pictures of your children, you probably have your email linked, you have private conversations that you've been exchanging via text. In a digital camera, you just have pictures. And so saying that like, hey, I don't want to open my phone is very different from saying, hey, I don't want to open this, you know, my digital camera. So we encourage everyone to use a cell phone to record anything that's going on when they're being a legal observer. Best practice number two, record at a safe distance. So at least 10 feet away. Like Ellen already said, you should be 6 feet away from everybody for COVID purposes. But being 10 feet away from a police officer when you're recording them is kind of the ideal distance. You can still capture everything that's going on, but you'll also be far enough away that they can't, you know, plausibly claim that you're interfering with their work. Also, a kind of third best practice, try to remain quiet so you can capture the audio of the incident. You know, I think sometimes there's an instinct to try to narrate what's happening and say, like, that officer is putting that man on the ground. But what's going to be more helpful evidence to the attorney who's representing the protester and ultimately to the court is going to be whatever's actually being verbally exchanged. So, you know, if the protester is saying something to the police officer, like my handcuffs are too tight, you know, something like that is going to be better than you saying that, you know, his handcuffs look too tight. So try to remain as quiet as possible. And then, as we already talked about a little bit, upload your footage to a secure cloud or send it to the legal observer coordinator / attorney as soon as possible. And this is just recognizing the reality that even though cops can't take your phone, they can't, you know, make you delete anything, you might be in a situation where you don't feel safe saying no to a request to hand over your phone or to delete a picture. And that'll make sure that you haven't lost the evidence. Even if something like that happens. Also, another practical reality, you might drop your phone. You know, protests are crazy and just being outside is crazy. People drop their phone, they break it, or you might lose your phone. So that's just a best practice to make sure that you're preserving the evidence that you spent so much time and hard work to collect. So what to do if something goes wrong? And the point of this slide isn't to freak you out or go through all the different things that can go wrong while you're legal observing. I think if you've been paying attention to the protests, there's a lot of things that are unpredictable, and things have unfortunately been escalated and become unsafe. So if there is something that goes wrong, that is more than just kind of the run of the mill kind of things that happen in a civil rights protest, we want you to prioritize your safety. That is the most important thing when you're acting as a legal observer. You being safe and you kind of getting away from an incident unscathed is going to be more helpful to protesters, both in the short term and the long term, than you staying and documenting something that's potentially unsafe to you. Stay calm. Once again, just kind of a best practice whenever you're anywhere. But don't run. Don't kind of throw things. Don't scream. Don't overreact. To the extent you can, just stay calm and get yourself away from the situation if it's unsafe. After you are in a safe place, you should contact the legal observer coordinator or attorney representing the protesters, and that might be a time where you can kind of share what you observed. If you did witness something going wrong, that could potentially be helpful for them, even if you didn't get to record it with your camera or through or with contemporaneous notes. You can still pass along that information, and it can still be helpful for protecting people's civil rights in the future. And comply with police. So we already kind of got this question, right? Like, that you are right, and that you have a right to do something, but the police can still tell you that you don't have that right, right? I mean, they can still say, you're wrong. You don't have a First Amendment right to film me. And even if you're 100% sure that you're right, if you feel unsafe, you should stop filming them. And I think that, or if you even feel that you're at risk for arrest and that doesn't make you feel unsafe, you should stop filming them, because you're not helping in terms of maintaining that neutrality and providing that credibility to your evidence. If you end up getting arrested, kind of everything you've documented that day is going to be pretty much useless if you end up getting arrested, unless it's just for your independent civil rights case now that you have to bring. So that's the most important thing. Even if your rights are being violated, we don't want you to get arrested. We don't want you to be in a position where you're unsafe. So always prioritize kind of your safety and your freedom above everything else when you're at these actions, acting as a legal observer.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. I think that last statement, really helps ground us and remind us of the difference between the Know Your Right to Protest training that we started this with and the legal observer role that we have ended it with. And we're going to have a little bit of time for questions, but first I want to make sure to acknowledge and talk about how, if you want to be a legal observer, what's sort of the next step. To be really clear, the ACLU of Kansas is not hosting a legal observer program. We are facilitating this training so y'all get the skills, and we will help make the connection to attorneys who are doing that work, but we are not hosting a formal program. Some ACLUs do, we are not at this time. So just so you know and are aware of that, the sort of actual next steps, after this training, I will send out an email to you all, including the PowerPoints, including the next steps, and help connect you with the cooperating attorneys on that work. And if you are interested, so now you all have been trained in legal observing. Some of you may say, this is not quite for me. Some of you will say, yes, I want to do it. If you want to be a legal observer, please send in the chat your full name, your first and last name. It will only be seen by Lauren and I. No one else will see it. So go ahead and send that right now. It will just come to us as the panelists, and that will be your sign up to be a legal observer, and we'll move forward with that. Okay, here we go. Someone has said, just to reiterate, no one should just be picking up their ready to go legal observer kit and heading to protest. One should be attached to a group with a legal observer cadre and move from there. And that is totally correct. Do not act alone in this as a legal observer. Lauren, do you want to talk a little bit more explicitly about that?
Sure. And one of the most important reasons why we don't want you to kind of just go out there and legal observe unconnected to anything, particularly unconnected to an attorney who's directing your work, is in order to ensure that any evidence you collect is privileged. So that's kind of number one. Even if you feel like you're very well trained and you know exactly what to do, the evidence you're collecting isn't going to be as valuable if it's not subject to attorney work product privilege. So that is why it's essential that you connect with the attorneys who are working with the protesters in a particular city. So once again, privilege, make sure that you're maintaining that, and you aren't going to be able to do that if you don't coordinate with the attorney that we'll connect you with.
I lost my unmute button for a second there. So any other questions? I haven't gotten any others in the Q&A box. Anybody? Oh, we've got, where should observers locate themselves at a protest? In the midst of the periphery or all over? Great question. Lauren, I'll let you take this. I will also just name COVID. We are in the middle of a pandemic, so you should always be 6 feet away from people if you choose to go to a protest. And I'll let Lauren give the more full answer.
That's a great point, or a great question. So one thing that I would say for if you're going to be a legal observer is that it's important to kind of maintain distance from the protesters and show that you are kind of a separate entity, not only to maintain kind of that neutrality or that appearance of neutrality, but also just because I think it's important. So you're going to be able to see more if you're kind of at the periphery of a crowd as opposed to kind of in it. You're only going to be in that situation. You're only going to be able to see your immediate surroundings, and it's going to be hard to kind of know like where the police are and kind of what's happening. In addition to that, in terms of whether you should kind of link up and be with a number of other legal observers in the same space, or whether you should spread out and fan out throughout the crowd, or around the crowd more likely. I think that really depends on how many legal observers are there. So you might want to work with other legal observers once you get there. Once you've already talked with your attorney coordinator, you might say, oh, there's only 2 of us. I guess one of us should be at the front and one of us should be at the back. If you have 25 legal observers, it might be fine for you to kind of pair up with someone 6 feet away, and kind of stand in close coordination with each other. So I think it's just important to know how many people are there vis-a-vis the size of the crowd. And it might, it really depends on the action. It might be something where if kind of everything, is happening on a platform or on a stage or kind of at a focal point, you might just want to be closer to that place because that's where the action's happening and that's where all the police and protesters are located. So I'm sorry, that was kind of a it depends response, which I hate those, but I think it really just does depend on the number of legal observers who are there, the number of protesters that are there, and kind of the nature of the action. But as a general matter, do try to station yourself separate from kind of the group of protesters in order to maintain that appearance of neutrality.
And we actually have a couple out-of-staters here, which is great. So we've got someone from New York and someone from Georgia. And the question is this transferable? Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. And so, I think different, it kind of depends on who's running the action in your state, whether this is going to be a transferable training or not. I think this is pretty closely tracks to the National Lawyers Guild training. And it pretty closely tracks to the trainings of a number of other ACLUs who are doing legal observer training. But you should really check with the action lead of any protest that you want to legal observe for, and also any kind of legal observer coordinator before you show up and say, you could say, hey, I was trained by the ACLU of Kansas. It was like, a 45-minute training. These are all the things I learned. Do I need to go through another training? So definitely ask them, and I would defer to them. But I think you've probably got most of the information you'll need to go and do this in other places.
Thanks, Lauren. And then the last is as a statement, not a question, but I will read it because it is correct. And I think Lauren hit on it just a second ago. Most legal observer organizers, so your cooperating attorney, will pair a novice with a more experienced person, if that is possible, so that you don't, if they'll help you decide whether to go alone or stay in a group or any of that kind of information. Any final questions? We've got time for about one more. And anybody who's interested in being a legal observer who has not sent your first and last name in the chat box, please send that now. Also, if you did not pre-register, please include your contact information. Any final questions? All right. I think we did it. I think we made it through together. Thank you all so much for joining us. I think this work is incredibly important. We're in an incredibly important point in our country's history right now. And it's really incredible to see so many folks show up to support and land on the right side of history. Really appreciate you all being here. Let us remember, let us celebrate, and let us, live on the legacy of the folks who were murdered in these last many years here in Kansas and across the United States. So I am thankful to be in this with you all, and I look forward to staying in contact. Keep an eye out for that email today. I know some folks have found that the emails are going to their junk mail, their spam box, their promotions box, so just make sure you check everywhere. The email will be coming from me again, so eglover@aclukansas.org. Thank you all so much. Have a good one.